The first thing people noticed about the Hawthorne estate wasn't the size of the house. It was the quiet. Not the peaceful kind. Not birdsong and wind through trees quiet. This was a controlled silence, the kind that felt supervised. The kind that made your footsteps sound louder than they should. Even the gravel driveway seemed to crunch more softly here, as if it knew better than to draw attention to itself. The house sat on several acres in Greenwich, Connecticut, tucked behind tall hedges trimmed into obedient lines. White stone. Black iron gates. Windows that reflected the sky so cleanly they looked unreal. Everything was expensive. Everything was perfect. And somehow nothing felt warm. Inside, the air always smelled faintly of lemon polish and something metallic, like money and restraint mixed together. The floors gleamed. The walls were bare except for abstract art that no one ever stopped to look at. The clocks ticked quietly, all synchronized, all correct. Time mattered here. Charles Hawthorne believed chaos was a failure of leadership. He believed messiness was a moral flaw. His hedge fund ran on discipline, and so did his home. Staff schedules were precise. Meals were timed. Conversations were efficient. Feelings were inconvenient. His wife had died years earlier, and after that, the house had changed. Or maybe it had always been this way and no one noticed until she was gone. Either way, the warmth disappeared with her. What remained was structure. Order. Rules that were never written down but somehow everyone knew. And then there was Julian. At 12 years old, Julian Hawthorne moved through the house like a question no one wanted to answer. He was small for his age, pale, with light brown hair that never quite stayed in place. His clothes were always clean. His posture always straight. His face almost always blank. Visitors often described him as quiet or well-behaved. Staff used different words when they spoke among themselves. They said he watched too closely. That he listened when he wasn't supposed to. That the temperature in a room seemed to drop when he entered, even if he didn't say a word. Julian rarely laughed. When he did, it was brief and sharp, like he'd practiced it in front of a mirror and decided it wasn't worth the effort. He spoke politely to adults, using complete sentences and calm tones that made people proud of him for reasons they couldn't quite explain. But something about him made people uneasy, especially the nannies. The Hawthorne household required help. Lots of it. The house was too big. Charles traveled constantly. Julian needed supervision, education, structure. On paper, it was a dream job. Excellent pay. Private living quarters. Full benefits. In reality, it was a revolving door. Nannies arrived with resumes and optimism. They lasted weeks, sometimes months, rarely longer. They left quietly, usually early in the morning, dragging suitcases across the driveway with their heads down. No one ever said why. When Charles was asked, he waved it off. Not a good fit, he'd say, already looking at his phone. Some people just aren't cut out for high standards. High standards. That phrase floated through the house like a warning. The staff learned quickly what it meant. Don't ask questions. Don't linger. Don't contradict Julian in front of his father. And above all, don't make problems. Problems were bad for morale. At night, when the house finally settled into stillness, the silence felt heavier. The kind that pressed against your ears. Somewhere down the hall, a door would close softly. Somewhere else, a floorboard would creak. And sometimes, if you were awake long enough, you'd hear a faint sound that didn't belong to the house at all. A sharp exhale. A whisper. A small, deliberate noise. No one talked about it the next morning. That was the rule. If you were new, you might think the Hawthorne estate was calm, orderly, impressive. You might even feel lucky to be there. But if you stayed long enough, you noticed the tension in people's shoulders. The way voices dropped when Julian passed by. The way adults seemed to apologize to a child without realizing they were doing it. This house didn't raise its voice. It didn't need to. And if you're listening to this story right now, paying attention to the quiet details most people miss, you might already sense it too. Some stories don't announce themselves with chaos. They begin with silence and dare you to stay long enough to hear what's hiding underneath. If you want to hear how this silence breaks, you'll want to stay close for what comes next. Because the house wasn't always this quiet. And the reason why was about to arrive. The next nanny was already on her way. Julian Hawthorne learned early that people behaved differently around him. He noticed it in the way adults straightened their backs when he entered a room. In the way conversations paused, then restarted with softer voices. He noticed how questions directed at him were careful, wrapped in politeness, as if the wrong word might break something fragile. He didn't know why at first. He only knew that whatever it was, it worked. At breakfast, staff asked what he wanted to eat even when the menu was already set. If he said cereal instead of eggs, cereal appeared. If he pushed a plate away untouched, no one scolded him. Someone quietly removed it and brought something else. When he walked through the house, people moved aside. Not obviously. Not dramatically. Just enough. Julian filed these observations away without emotion. The house taught him patterns and he learned them the way other children learn games. His father was rarely home before midnight. When Charles Hawthorne was present, he moved through the estate with purpose. Phone pressed to his ear, eyes already elsewhere. Conversations with his son were short, transactional. How was school? Fine. Any issues? No. Good. That was usually the end of it. Julian ate dinner alone most nights, seated at a long table built for 12. The chair across from him stayed empty. The overhead lights reflected off polished wood, making the space feel even larger than it was. Sometimes he imagined the echo of his fork hitting the plate just to see if it would fill the room. It never did. At school, teachers praised his intelligence. His grades were excellent. His handwriting was precise. He followed instructions perfectly, right up until the moment he didn't. Other students kept their distance. Julian didn't chase friendships. He didn't understand why people wanted them. Friends left. People always did. Adults pretended they wouldn't, but eventually they found reasons. The nannies were the proof. They came and went with alarming regularity. Each one arrived smiling, hopeful, carrying bags and plans and promises. Each one learned the rules quickly, or thought they did. Julian tested them in small ways at first. A question asked twice just to see if the answer stayed the same. A request delivered as a command. A pause that stretched too long. Some nannies corrected him gently. Others laughed it off. A few tried to assert authority, quoting schedules and expectations. Those were his favorites, because authority was fragile. And Julian liked discovering where things broke. The first time he spat on a nanny, he was 10. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It happened in the hallway outside the study, where the cameras didn't quite reach. The nanny had told him to put his shoes away. Her voice wasn't unkind, but it carried expectation. Julian looked up at her face. He saw the confidence there, the assumption, and something inside him tightened. He spat. Just once. The sound surprised even him. The wetness on her cheek shocked her into silence. Her eyes widened, confusion rushing in before anger could catch up. "I'm telling your father," she said, voice shaking. Julian nodded. "Okay." She told Charles that evening. Julian stood beside his father, hands folded, eyes lowered. He didn't deny it outright. He simply said, "I don't remember that." Charles sighed, exhausted. He apologized to the nanny on Julian's behalf. Promised to handle it. Promised it wouldn't happen again. It did. Again and again. Each time the reaction was the same. Disbelief. Minimization. Quiet settlements. Resignations submitted with forced smiles and trembling hands. Julian watched carefully. He learned that adults would explain his behavior before they punished it. That his father believed explanations more than witnesses. That discomfort made people leave faster than honesty ever could. He learned that spitting did something interesting. It erased authority. Afterward, the nannies avoided eye contact. Their voices softened. Their corrections turned into suggestions. They became careful around him, like stepping around broken glass. Julian didn't enjoy their fear. He enjoyed their retreat, because retreat meant they would leave, and leaving meant he was right. By the time he turned 12, the pattern was established. New nannies arrived unaware. Julian tested. They failed. The house absorbed the fallout and moved on. But then something shifted. One afternoon, Julian noticed a woman he hadn't seen before standing in the hallway near the service stairs. She wasn't carrying folders or schedules. She wasn't watching him nervously. She was unpacking cleaning supplies. She looked up once, met his eyes, gave a small nod. Then she went back to work. No smile, no apology, no hesitation. Julian frowned. For the first time in a long while, the pattern didn't fit. And that unsettled him more than anything else ever had. The nannies never compared notes out loud. Not inside the Hawthorne house. There, everything was professional, polite, smoothed over. Resignations were typed carefully, signed neatly, and handed to the household manager with practiced calm. Reasons were vague. Personal circumstances. A better opportunity. Family matters. But outside the gates, the truth moved differently. It traveled through hushed phone calls made from parked cars. Through group chats that went quiet when someone mentioned Greenwich. Through raised eyebrows at agency offices in Manhattan and Stamford when a familiar address appeared on a placement request. The Hawthorne job paid extremely well. That was the problem. Good pay attracted people who needed it. People with student loans, aging parents, custody battles, fresh starts. The kind of people who convinced themselves they could handle anything for the right compensation. At first, the agencies believed the explanations. High standards. Difficult child. Demanding household. That wasn't unusual in wealthy families. But after the fifth nanny left early, then the sixth, patterns emerged. One nanny lasted 3 weeks. She said Julian had boundary issues. Another made it 4 months. She cried quietly in the lobby when she returned her keys. A third stayed barely long enough to unpack. She refused to explain why she was leaving, only repeating, "I can't," like a broken switch. The agencies adjusted their screening. They sent their most experienced staff. Former teachers. Behavioral specialists. People who spoke confidently about structure and emotional intelligence. Those didn't last either. The whispers started after a woman named Denise, who had worked in high-conflict households for over a decade, walked out mid-shift. She didn't wait for backup. Didn't collect her last paycheck in person. She emailed a resignation that night with one sentence. "Please don't send anyone else there without warning them." That sentence was forwarded. Quietly. Selectively. From then on, the Hawthorne address carried weight. People lowered their voices when they said it. Agencies debated whether to keep accepting the contract at all. But money has a way of dulling caution, and Charles Hawthorne paid more every time someone left. Inside the house, the turnover was handled efficiently. New nannies were introduced to Julian with polite enthusiasm. "This is your new caregiver," someone would say, as if the word itself held magic. Julian would look up from whatever he was doing and offer a small nod. "Hello," he'd say. And the cycle would begin again. The first few days were always calm. Julian behaved, observed, listened. He learned their rhythms, their habits, how they corrected him, how they reacted to resistance. Some tried warmth. They praised him excessively, tried to win him over with snacks and compliments. Julian tolerated them, but something about their eagerness bored him. Others tried firmness. Schedules taped to the fridge. Clear rules. Consequences explained carefully. Those were the ones who didn't last. The moment usually came without warning. A correction delivered too confidently. A raised eyebrow. A tone that suggested expectation rather than request. Julian waited until they were alone. Then he spat. The reactions varied. Shock was universal. Some gasped. Some stepped back. One woman laughed nervously, convinced it had to be a joke. It never was. Anger followed. Hurt. Disbelief. "I'm telling your father," they'd say. Julian never stopped them. Charles Hawthorne listened with visible impatience. He apologized. He frowned. He promised intervention. Then he called his son into the room. Julian stood quietly, eyes down, hands folded. "Did you do this?" Charles asked. "I don't remember," Julian replied evenly. Charles rubbed his temples. He looked tired, embarrassed, distracted. "I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding," he'd say. Julian isn't like that. And just like that, reality bent. The nannies learned the truth in those moments. Not about Julian, but about the system protecting him. They realized there would be no accountability, no apology that mattered, no change. Some stayed a little longer after that. Their voices softened. Their authority eroded. They stopped correcting Julian unless absolutely necessary. That didn't help. Julian sensed it immediately. Fear, once present, changed everything. He watched it spread in small ways. The way they flinched, the way they avoided being alone with him, the way their patience disappeared. He didn't chase them when they left. He watched them go from upstairs windows, faces unreadable. Each departure confirmed what he already believed. People were temporary. The house absorbed each exit without ceremony. A room cleaned. Sheets changed. A new schedule printed. But something else was happening too. The staff who remained grew quieter, more careful. They spoke in coded language. They warned new hires without saying too much. And then Lorraine Ellis arrived. Not as a nanny, as a housekeeper. Julian noticed her name wasn't spoken with the same forced cheer. He noticed no one gave her a binder full of rules. No one hovered nearby, waiting for disaster. She unpacked her supplies calmly, efficiently, as if she expected nothing from anyone. Julian stood at the top of the stairs and watched. This time the cycle didn't begin the way it always had. And that made him curious, uncomfortably curious. If the Hawthorne estate had walls that listened, the staffing agencies had walls that remembered. They were nothing like the house in Greenwich. No marble floors. No sweeping staircases. Just narrow offices in Manhattan and Westchester, with chipped desks, overworked printers, and coffee that tasted burned no matter how fresh it was. These places survived on reputation, trust, quiet honesty, and the Hawthorne name complicated all three. When a placement coordinator first said it out loud, Greenwich, private estate, live-in nanny, excellent compensation, it still sounded like opportunity. Phones rang. Candidates leaned forward. Pens paused mid-note. Then someone would ask carefully, "Which family?" And the room would shift. Not dramatically. Just enough. Pause. A glance exchanged between co-workers. A sigh that came a second too late. "Hawthorne," the coordinator would say. That's when the questions started. Not the official ones. The real ones. How long did the last one stay? Did she say why she left? Are they difficult? Answers were never direct. High expectations. Strong personalities. Not everyone's cup of tea. But in the break rooms, away from clients and contracts, the language was different. One coordinator pulled up a spreadsheet she kept hidden behind an innocuous file name. It wasn't official. It was survival. Names, dates, durations, reasons coded in shorthand. 3 weeks, 4 months, 11 days. One entry had a single note typed in all caps, spit. That word traveled. A former nanny mentioned it in passing to a friend. The friend told someone else. Soon, the kid who spits became a phrase that didn't need explanation. Agencies tried to contain it. They had to. Charles Hawthorne was a powerful client, and powerful clients didn't like rumors. But rumors thrived on silence. Some agencies began adding quiet disclaimers. The child has behavioral challenges. Others stopped accepting the job altogether, claiming scheduling conflicts or lack of qualified candidates. But money has gravity. Charles increased the pay again. Added bonuses, promised discretion. The more he offered, the more complicated refusal became. One agency finally tried transparency. They warned a candidate gently, told her the child could be testing, that previous placements had ended early. They asked if she was comfortable with conflict. She said yes. She left 2 months later with shaking hands and no explanation beyond, "I should have listened." After that, agencies developed an unspoken rule. If someone accepted the Hawthorne placement, it was because they needed the job more than they feared the unknown. And when they left, no one pushed for details. The truth had weight, and weight slowed business. Inside the Hawthorne house, Julian had no idea any of this was happening. Or maybe he did, in the way children sense tension without being told. He knew new nannies arrived less frequently now. He noticed how staff avoided eye contact when the subject came up. He also noticed something else. Lorraine Ellis wasn't discussed the same way. Her name didn't appear on agency lists. No placement coordinator checked in weekly. No evaluation forms followed her arrival. She came through a different channel entirely. A recommendation passed between households, a quiet referral from someone who had seen her work and trusted her discretion. To the agencies, she barely existed. That made her different. Julian watched her from afar. He saw how she moved through the house without asking permission. How she didn't rush when spoken to, but also didn't linger. How she listened more than she spoke. He saw how other staff relaxed around her. That was new. In the evenings, Julian sometimes overheard fragments of conversations drifting from the kitchen or laundry room. Not warnings. Not fear. Relief. "She's steady," someone said once. "She doesn't take things personal," said another. "She's seen worse," a third voice murmured. Julian didn't like that. Not because it threatened him. Because it made him feel unnecessary. For the first time, the house had someone who didn't orbit around his behavior. Someone who didn't adjust their tone or pace when he passed by. Someone who existed independently of him. That unsettled the balance. Julian began paying closer attention, timing his movements, testing proximity, waiting for signs. None came. Lorraine cleaned, organized, cooked when needed, fixed small things before they broke. She didn't report to him. She didn't avoid him either. She simply existed. And for a boy who had learned that control came from disruption, that was a problem. Because if someone couldn't be pushed away, then maybe the rules he'd learned weren't rules at all. Maybe they were just habits. And habits, Julian was starting to realize, could be broken. He just didn't know yet who would break first. Lorraine Ellis arrived on a damp Tuesday morning just after 6. The fog hung low over the driveway, curling around the edges of the iron gates like it had a mind of its own. She parked her old sedan quietly, already aware that any loud sound would echo across the estate and be noticed. That was the first rule she learned without anyone telling her. In a house like this, noise was suspicious. Silence was safe. She had been a housekeeper in wealthy homes before, but the Hawthorne estate was different. The place was so big that it had corridors leading nowhere, wings she would never clean, rooms she would never enter. Marble floors gleamed under the soft light of early morning. Chandeliers hung in the hallways like frozen waterfalls. Everything smelled faintly of lemon polish and money. Lorraine didn't smile. She didn't wave at the staff in the foyer. She nodded to the household manager, a man named Dennis, who barely looked up from his clipboard. She carried her small bag with a quiet confidence, as if she belonged in 100 houses like this before. Julian Hawthorne noticed her immediately. He was at the top of the grand staircase, peering over the railing with that same intense, quiet stare he used on everyone new. Lorraine didn't flinch. She unpacked her supplies methodically, setting cleaning solutions in neat rows, wiping dust from the shelves with calm, deliberate movements. Her attention never wavered, not for a second. Julian frowned. It was the first time in a long time he had felt the need to frown. The nannies would have cowered, stammered, apologizing for every movement. This woman simply existed in the space, acknowledging nothing, seeking nothing. He tilted his head. That unsettled him more than defiance ever could. Lorraine started with the areas closest to the staff quarters, quietly assessing the state of the floors, the surfaces, and the rooms. She moved efficiently, not in a rush, but with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what needed attention. Her hands were steady, her pace unflappable. Julian watched as she maneuvered through the kitchen and hallway, making notes in her head, adjusting objects slightly here and there, quietly improving the environment. The first week passed with Julian observing her every day. He tried his usual tests, calling her name sharply when she bent down, leaving small obstacles in her path, even whispering commands from the stairwell. Lorraine barely acknowledged him. A subtle tilt of her head here, a slight nod there, but never fear. Never panic. Never deference. She treated him the same way she treated the furniture or the floors, as something to be respected, managed, but not feared. For Julian this was unprecedented. All the other nannies had bent themselves around his behavior. They had apologized for his outbursts, corrected him cautiously, flinched when he spat or shouted. Lorraine didn't. That lack of reaction was a challenge he couldn't ignore. It drew him closer, made him try harder. One afternoon, he followed her quietly to the indoor pool area. The light from the skylight danced across the marble tiles as Lorraine wiped them down, her reflection sharp and clear. Julian made a noise behind her, soft, deliberate, but she didn't turn immediately. When she did, she looked at him, met his gaze evenly, and then returned to her work. No reprimand, no fear, no delight in control. Just presence. That evening Julian lay in bed thinking. He could not understand why this woman didn't respond like the others. Her calmness was not weakness. It was something else. He couldn't figure it out, and that frustrated him more than anything else ever had. Meanwhile, Lorraine kept her own observations. She watched the patterns in the house, the whispered apologies, the careful tones, the tension that clung to the walls. She had learned to navigate wealthy households, but the Hawthorne estate was different. The boy was unusual. Not in misbehavior alone, but in how he had learned to manipulate, to test, to control the adults around him. Most children didn't develop strategies like that at 12. Most children didn't understand fear as a lever. She made a mental note. Keep calm, stay neutral, don't react to provocations. That was her rule. It had worked before. It would work here. But even Lorraine could sense that Julian was testing her in ways she had never seen before. And for the first time, she felt the weight of something heavier than a messy house or an uncooperative staff. She felt the curiosity of a boy who had learned to push people away and the challenge of someone who refused to be pushed. The house had a rhythm. Lorraine fit into it naturally, adjusting without making waves. Julian, on the other hand, was off rhythm, disrupted by her presence. He realized that this simple fact, the inability to unsettle her, was more than irritating. It was the beginning of something he couldn't yet name, a crack in the structure he thought unbreakable. By the end of the week, both of them knew something had shifted, even if neither would say it aloud. Julian's tests were becoming subtler, more precise. Lorraine's attention was measured but alert. And somewhere between the polished floors and the silent halls, a quiet tension began to build, one neither of them fully understood yet. If you're intrigued by how this quiet battle begins and how Julian reacts when his usual games no longer work, hit subscribe to follow the story. And hey, comment where you're watching from. I'd love to see who's joining the Hawthorne House journey. But as the sun set over the estate that Friday, Julian lingered at the staircase longer than usual, watching Lorraine disappear into the staff quarters. Something about her presence refused to leave him alone, and for the first time he wondered if he had finally met someone who wouldn't leave. Little did he know the first real test was only days away. Julian began watching Lorraine the way some people watched storms on the horizon. Not because they were afraid, but because they wanted to understand when the shift would come. He memorized her routines quickly. She woke before most of the house, always at the same time. He heard her footsteps in the hallway at dawn, soft and even, never rushed. She cleaned the same rooms in the same order. Laundry first, then the kitchen, then the common areas. She worked with a quiet confidence that didn't invite conversation, but didn't shut it down either. What bothered Julian most was that she never looked over her shoulder. The nannies always did. They checked doorways before speaking. They glanced behind themselves when correcting him. Even when they tried to hide it, their bodies betrayed them. Lorraine's didn't. When Julian entered a room, she didn't stiffen. She didn't soften her voice. She didn't suddenly perform kindness or authority. She treated his presence the same way she treated a chair or a table. Something to move around, not something that controlled the space. That unsettled him. He tried standing too close. Lorraine simply stepped aside without comment. He tried speaking sharply. "You missed a spot." She looked where he pointed. Looked back at him. "I'll check again," she said neutral, then continued wiping. No apology. No irritation. No fear. Julian started lingering in doorways, pretending to read while watching her reflection in polished surfaces. He followed her at a distance, careful not to be obvious. He wanted to catch her doing something human. Something weak. Something that proved she was like the others. But Lorraine never gave him that satisfaction. She hummed sometimes quietly when she thought no one was around. Old songs, unfamiliar ones. She laughed once, softly, at something on the radio while folding towels. The sound startled Julian. It wasn't loud or performative. It didn't ask to be noticed. It existed on its own. That was wrong. Julian tested proximity next. One afternoon, he waited until she was cleaning the hallway outside the study. He walked past her slowly, then stopped directly behind her. Close enough that she could feel his presence if she was paying attention. She kept working. Julian's jaw tightened. "You're in my way," he said. Lorraine glanced back briefly. "I'll be done in a minute." Her tone wasn't dismissive. It wasn't obedient either. It was factual. Julian waited for irritation to rise in her face. It didn't. He walked away instead, unsettled by the unfamiliar sensation curling in his chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't triumph. It was something closer to confusion. From the staff's perspective, Lorraine's arrival changed small things. Conversations loosened. Shoulders dropped. People stopped whispering quite as much. They didn't trust the calm, but they appreciated it. "She's solid," one cook murmured one evening. Julian heard it from the stairs. Solid. He didn't like that word. Solid things didn't move when pushed. That night, Julian lay awake staring at the ceiling. His room was immaculate. Toys arranged. Books lined up. Everything where it belonged. He replayed Lorraine's reactions in his mind, searching for cracks. There had to be one. Everyone had one. The opportunity came sooner than expected. It happened near the indoor pool, a place Julian knew well. The acoustics there swallowed sound. The cameras didn't cover every angle. It was where other nannies had made their mistakes, where fear had surfaced too quickly. Lorraine was scrubbing the marble floor near the water, gloves on, bucket beside her. The smell of chlorine hung in the air. Light filtered through the skylights, casting rippling reflections across the walls. Julian approached quietly. He stood where she couldn't see him unless she turned her head. He waited. His heart beat steadily. Not fast. He had done this before. When he spoke, his voice was sharp. "You're doing it wrong." Lorraine didn't turn immediately. She finished the motion she was making, then straightened slowly. She looked at him. Really looked at him this time. Her eyes weren't cold. They weren't warm either. They were attentive. "How so?" she asked. Julian swallowed. He hadn't expected a question. "You missed a spot," he said, pointing to a place already clean. Lorraine followed his finger. She nodded once. "I'll look again." She bent down. Julian felt the familiar tightening in his chest. The moment where power usually arrived. Where the world tilted back into place. He leaned forward. And then, Lorraine paused. She didn't turn around. She didn't move away. She just said quietly, "Before you do anything, think about what you want to happen next." The words landed heavier than any accusation ever had. Julian froze. The silence stretched. And for the first time since he was 10 years old, Julian wasn't sure what he wanted to happen at all. Julian didn't move. Lorraine stayed bent over the marble floor, one knee touching the cold stone, one hand resting on the bucket handle. The water inside had stopped sloshing. The indoor pool hummed softly, a low mechanical sound that made the silence feel thicker. "Think about what you want to happen next." The words echoed in Julian's head longer than they should have. This wasn't how it usually went. Usually there was no pause, no space to think, just the rush. The familiar tightening in his chest, followed by relief. Control. Proof. He leaned forward anyway. The sound was small. What? Precise. Spit landed on Lorraine's cheek. For a brief, dangerous second, Julian braced himself. This was the moment he knew well. The sharp inhale. The sudden movement. The explosion that came right before everything fell apart. But Lorraine didn't gasp. She didn't shout. She didn't even turn around right away. She stayed exactly where she was. Slowly, deliberately, she set the sponge down. She took off one glove, then the other. She placed them neatly on the edge of the bucket, as if she were finishing a task, not reacting to an insult. Then she stood. Lorraine wiped her cheek once with the back of her bare hand. The motion was calm, controlled, final. She turned to face Julian. Her eyes met his, steady and clear. "That's not how you speak to people," she said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. It wasn't angry. It was factual. Like correcting a measurement. Julian felt his stomach twist. "You're just the maid," he said, the words coming out sharper than he intended. "That's your job." Lorraine nodded once. "That's my job," she agreed. "Not my worth." The sentence landed quietly between them. Julian waited for more. For punishment. For threats. For a lecture about respect or consequences or calling his father. None came. Lorraine picked up her gloves. Put them back on. Returned to scrubbing the floor like the moment had already passed. Julian stood there, heart beating harder now, not from excitement but from something closer to panic. "You're supposed to tell my dad," he said. Lorraine didn't look up. "If you want me to." He frowned. "Don't you care?" She paused. Just for a second. "I care about what you're learning," she said. "Not about embarrassing you." That wasn't right. That wasn't how adults behaved. Julian backed away slowly, his shoes squeaking faintly against the marble. He left the pool area without another word, his mind racing, replaying every second. That night he listened for raised voices. There were none. No meeting in the study. No tense conversations. No staff whispering. Lorraine hadn't reported him. That unsettled him more than if she had. The next morning, Julian tested her again. He knocked over a stack of folded towels in the hallway and waited. Lorraine bent down, picked them up, and refolded them without comment. At lunch, he ignored her when she spoke to him. She didn't chase his attention. In the afternoon, he stood too close while she cleaned a window. She stepped aside without complaint. No fear. No retaliation. No victory. By the third day, Julian noticed something else. He didn't want to spit on her again. The urge still came. The tightening still happened. But it stopped short, like his body no longer trusted the outcome. He watched Lorraine interact with other staff. He saw how they relaxed around her. How their shoulders dropped. How they spoke freely. He watched her eat quietly in the staff kitchen, alone but not lonely, and for reasons he didn't understand yet that made his chest ache. Then came the afternoon that changed the rules again. A new nanny arrived. Young. Confident. Carefully optimistic. Julian watched her from the stairs as she was introduced, saw the way she smiled at him, saw the hope in her eyes. He felt the old pattern stir. Later that evening, Lorraine passed Julian in the hallway. "She won't stay," Julian said flatly. Lorraine stopped walking. "What makes you think that?" she asked. Julian shrugged. "They never do." Lorraine studied him for a long moment. "Maybe they never felt safe enough to." Julian scoffed. "Safe? Yes," Lorraine said. "Safe to be human around you." The words followed him all the way back to his room. That night, Julian stood outside the new nanny's door, listening to her unpack. He could hear her humming softly. He felt the familiar urge rising again. But this time something else rose with it. A question. And for the first time, Julian hesitated long enough to wonder what would happen if he didn't do what he always did. Behind him, unseen, Lorraine watched from the end of the hall, waiting to see which choice he would make. Lorraine didn't say anything the next morning. That was what unsettled Julian most. He came down for breakfast expecting something. A look. A comment. A quiet warning. The house was awake earlier than usual. Plates clinked softly in the kitchen. Coffee machines hummed. The smell of toast drifted through the air. Lorraine moved between counters, calm as ever. She didn't acknowledge Julian's presence beyond a brief nod. No tension. No aftermath. Julian sat at the long dining table, swinging his legs slightly, watching her from the corner of his eye. He waited for the delayed reaction. Adults always had one. If they didn't explode immediately, they circled back later with consequences wrapped in disappointment. Nothing came. By mid-morning, the absence of reaction gnawed at him. So Julian did what he had learned to do when the world felt uncertain. He escalated. It happened in the hallway near the staff elevator, just out of view of the main cameras. The new nanny, her name was Claire, had asked him to wash his hands before lunch. Her tone was firm but friendly. The same mistake others had made. Julian turned slowly. He spat. Claire gasped. The sound was sharp, involuntary. She staggered back a step, hand flying to her cheek. Her face flushed red with shock and humiliation. "What, Julian?" Her voice cracked. "That is completely unacceptable." Lorraine heard it. She appeared at the end of the hallway almost instantly, eyes taking in the scene without dramatics. She didn't rush to Julian. She didn't comfort Claire right away either. She assessed. Claire was shaking. Julian was watching closely. Lorraine stepped beside Claire and handed her a clean cloth. "Take a minute," she said quietly. "I'll stay here." Claire wiped her face, breathing hard. "I'm telling your father," she said to Julian, voice trembling now. This is not okay." Julian shrugged. "Okay." He walked away. The familiar rhythm resumed. Within an hour, Claire was sitting stiffly in the study across from Charles Hawthorne. Julian stood beside his father, hands folded, eyes lowered just enough to look remorseful. Claire spoke carefully at first, then faster, then with visible frustration. "He spat on me," she said, deliberately. "And it's not the first time. I was warned, but I didn't understand how serious." Charles sighed. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. "Julian," he said tiredly, "is that true?" Julian's voice was calm. "I don't remember doing that." Silence. Charles looked at Claire. "You see, he's been under a lot of stress lately. Changes. Adjustments." Claire stared at him. "Stress doesn't excuse." "I'm sure you're doing your best," Charles interrupted. "But maybe this isn't the right environment for you." The sentence landed like a door slamming shut. Claire's mouth opened. Close. She looked at Julian. Then at Charles. "I was assaulted," she said quietly. Charles stood. "The meeting was over. We'll compensate you for the remainder of the week." Claire left the study pale and furious, eyes glossy with unshed tears. Julian watched her go. The outcome had unfolded exactly as expected. But something was wrong. Later that afternoon, Lorraine found Claire packing. "She always wins," Claire said bitterly, stuffing clothes into a suitcase. "I should have listened." Lorraine leaned against the doorframe. You didn't do anything wrong. Claire laughed hollowly. That's what everyone says. Doesn't change anything. Lorraine nodded. She didn't argue. When Claire left, the house absorbed her absence like it always did. The room was cleaned. The schedule adjusted. Another name quietly crossed off a list no one officially kept. Julian felt the familiar confirmation settle in his chest. See, people leave. But when he passed Lorraine in the hallway later, something unexpected happened. She didn't avoid him. She stopped. Do you know why nothing changes? She asked calmly. Julian looked at her warily. Because my dad believes me. That's part of it, Lorraine said. But it's also because no one ever stays long enough to tell the whole truth. Julian frowned. You're still here. For now, Lorraine replied. The words weren't a threat. They were a promise with an expiration date. That night, Julian lay awake longer than usual. He replayed the meeting in the study. Claire's face. Lorraine's calm voice. For the first time, the pattern felt incomplete. As if one piece hadn't moved the way it was supposed to. Down the hall, Lorraine sat on the edge of her bed, hands folded in her lap, staring at the wall. She had stayed quiet today. But she knew silence couldn't last forever. And soon, staying would require a choice neither of them was ready to make yet. The incident should have ended there. In the Hawthorne house, things always ended quietly. People vanished from the schedule. Names stopped being spoken. The walls swallowed conflict whole. But this time something lingered. Julian felt it the next day in the way Lorraine watched him. Not closely, not suspiciously, but deliberately. As if she were paying attention to moments others dismissed. The pauses. The in-betweens. The silence after words that should have landed harder. She didn't confront him. She didn't lecture. She waited. That unsettled him more than shouting ever could. In the afternoon, Julian sat alone in the sunroom, a tablet forgotten beside him. He was supposed to be doing schoolwork, but his thoughts kept circling back to Claire. Not her face, he'd already filed that away, but the sound of her voice when she said, "I was assaulted." No one had ever used that word before. The door creaked softly. Lorraine stepped in with a tray. 2 cups of hot chocolate. Real milk. Cinnamon dusted on top. Julian narrowed his eyes. "What's this for?" "For sitting," Lorraine said simply, setting 1 cup down near him and taking the opposite chair. "You look tired." "I'm not." She nodded, accepting the answer without argument. They sat in silence for a minute. Sunlight spilled across the floor, warm and lazy. Julian waited for the speech. The disappointment. The warning about consequences. None came. Instead, Lorraine asked, "Do you remember your first nanny?" Julian stiffened. "Which one?" "The one before the accidents," she said gently. "Before the house got so quiet." He stared at the window. Her name was Elise. "What happened to her?" "She left," Julian said flatly. "Like they all do." Lorraine took a slow sip of her drink. "Why do you think she left?" Julian shrugged. "Because I was difficult. Because I was a problem." "That's what people say." "That's what people say," Lorraine echoed. "Is that what you believe?" Julian hesitated. The truth pressed against his chest, uncomfortable and sharp. "I think," he said slowly, "people leave because it's easier." Lorraine looked at him then. Really looked. "That's not a child's thought," she said softly. Julian's jaw tightened. "I'm not a child." "I know," Lorraine replied. "That's the problem." Something cracked. Not loudly, not enough to be noticed by anyone passing the hallway, but enough for Julian to feel it. Lorraine leaned forward slightly. "When people leave, what do you tell yourself?" He swallowed. "That it was going to happen anyway." "And if it's going to happen anyway," she continued, "why not make it faster?" Julian's fingers curled around the edge of the table. "You don't know anything about me," he snapped. Lorraine didn't flinch. "You're right. But I know patterns." She paused. "Hurting someone first feels like control. Like proof that you chose the ending. Julian stood abruptly, chair scraping. You think I'm some kind of... I think you're scared, Lorraine said quietly. The word landed harder than any accusation. Julian laughed sharply. Of what? Of being left, she said. And of being seen. He turned away, heart pounding. You're wrong. Lorraine didn't push. She stood, gathered the tray and headed for the door. Just before leaving she said, You didn't win with Claire. Julian spun around. Yes, I did. No, Lorraine replied. You proved your father will always protect you. She looked back at him, eyes steady. But you also proved that no one protects you from yourself. The door closed. Julian stood there long after she left. That evening, Charles Hawthorne returned late as usual. Dinner was quiet. Julian barely spoke. His father barely noticed. Afterward, Julian wandered the house, restless. He passed the study, the kitchen, the hallway where Claire had stood, shaking. He stopped. Something unfamiliar rose in his throat. Anger? No. Regret. He hated it. Later that night, Julian crept into the kitchen for water and found Lorraine there, writing in a small notebook. What are you doing? He asked. She didn't hide it. Keeping records. Of what? Of moments, she said. In case the truth needs help remembering itself. Julian frowned. Are you writing about me? Yes, Lorraine said. And about the others. A chill crept up his spine. Why? Lorraine closed the notebook. Because stories don't disappear just because powerful people ignore them. She met his eyes. And because one day you're going to want to know what really happened in this house. Julian stared at her, pulse racing. For the first time the thought crossed his mind, not clearly but sharply enough to hurt. What if she didn't leave? And worse, what if she was the one person who shouldn't? The next morning the house woke before Julian did. That alone was unusual. He sensed it the moment his eyes opened. The air felt tighter, like something had already happened without him. Voices carried faintly through the hall. Doors opened and closed with purpose instead of routine. Julian sat up slowly. From his bed he could hear Lorraine's voice. Come. Measured. Not rushed. Another voice answered her. Mel. Lower. Unfamiliar. Julian swung his legs over the side of the bed, irritation spiking. Visitors were rare. Unscheduled ones were almost unheard of. He dressed quickly and cracked the door open. Down the hall, near the study, Lorraine stood with a man in a dark jacket. Not a suit. Not staff. He held a folder under one arm and spoke quietly, leaning in just enough to suggest privacy. Julian felt a flicker of something close to panic. He stepped out, deliberately loud. Lorraine glanced up. Their eyes met. Something passed between them, an understanding, maybe a warning. Good morning, the man said, straightening. His smile was polite but careful, the kind adults used when children were present but inconvenient. Julian looked at Lorraine. Who's that? This is Daniel Brooks, Lorraine said evenly. Julian stiffened. The name meant nothing but the way she said it did. A friend? Julian pressed. A mandated reporter, Daniel said gently. The word hit like ice water. Julian laughed, sharp and disbelieving. That's not funny. No one's joking, Lorraine replied. Julian's gaze snapped to her. You promised. I promised not to lie, she said. I kept that promise. Julian's chest tightened. About what? Daniel cleared his throat. Julian, I work with family services. I just have a few questions. Julian took a step back. My father isn't here. I know, Daniel said. This isn't about him. That made it worse. Julian's thoughts raced. Claire. The word assault. The notebook. Lorraine's records. You went behind my back, Julian said to Lorraine, his voice low. No, she replied. I walked in front of you. Daniel raised a hand. We're not here to punish anyone. Julian scoffed. That's a lie. Lorraine watched him carefully. Julian, this isn't a trap. Then why does it feel like one? Because a quiet voice inside him answered, traps only scare you when you know you might deserve them. Daniel suggested they talk in the sitting room. Julian followed, every step heavy. He perched on the edge of a chair, arms crossed, posture defensive. Daniel asked simple questions at first. School. Friends. How many nannies he remembered. Julian answered with practiced detachment. Then the question shifted. How do you usually express anger? Julian shrugged. I don't get angry. Lorraine inhaled softly but said nothing. Daniel nodded as if that answer told him more than a confession. When you feel abandoned, what do? Julian's jaw tightened. People don't abandon me. Julian, Daniel said calmly, you've had 11 nannies in 3 years. Silence fell hard. Julian looked at Lorraine. You told him everything. I told the truth, she said. Daniel leaned forward. Did you spit on Claire? Julian's breath caught. She exaggerated. Did you touch her? No. Did you threaten her? Julian hesitated. Lorraine closed her eyes. Daniel waited. I said she'd be gone by morning, Julian muttered. Daniel nodded slowly. And she was. The room felt smaller. What happens now? Julian asked, forcing bravado into his voice. Daniel hesitated. That depends. On what? On whether this behavior continues, Daniel said. And on whether the adults responsible intervene. Julian laughed bitterly. They won't. Lorraine spoke then, voice steady. I will. Julian whipped around. You can't. I can, she replied. And I already have. Daniel stood. We'll be in touch. As he left, Julian turned to Lorraine, panic finally breaking through his anger. You're ruining everything, he said. Lorraine looked at him, sadness etched deep. I'm trying to save something. Save who? Julian demanded. She hesitated. Then quietly, you. Julian felt something unravel. That afternoon his father called. Charles's voice crackled through the phone, sharp and irritated. Why is there a social worker asking questions about my house? Julian said nothing. Lorraine stood nearby, arms folded, listening. Charles continued, this ends today. Julian looked at Lorraine. For the first time he wondered, not if she would leave, but how much damage he could do before she was forced to. Charles Hawthorne came home early that day. That never happened. His presence announced itself before his voice did. The heavy thud of the front door. Shoes placed too carefully on the mat. The subtle shift in the house's rhythm, like furniture bracing for impact. Julian was in the living room when his father entered. He felt small instantly, which made him angry, which made him straighten his shoulders. Charles loosened his tie, eyes already sharp. Go to your room. Julian didn't move. I said. I know what you said, Julian replied, surprising even himself. Charles paused. Slowly he turned. Excuse me? Lorraine stood in the doorway behind them, silent. Watching. Julian's heart pounded. He hated that she was there. Hated that he wanted her to be. You brought a stranger into this house, Charles said to Lorraine without looking at her. You violated my privacy. I followed the law, Lorraine said calmly. Charles finally faced her. You overstepped. No, she replied. I stepped where no one else would. Charles laughed once, humorless. You're a nanny. Lorraine met his gaze. And you're a father. The word hung between them heavy. Charles's jaw tightened. Julian upstairs. Now. Julian looked at Lorraine. She gave him a small nod. Not permission. Reassurance. He turned and went. From the hallway he could still hear them. You embarrassed me, Charles snapped. Do you know what that man could cost me? I know what silence has already cost your son, Lorraine said. You don't know my son. I know he spits when he's scared, Lorraine replied. I know he pushes people away before they can leave. I know he hasn't had a consistent caregiver in years. Charles scoffed. He's privileged. He's lonely. The argument lowered, voices muffled. Julian pressed his back against his bedroom door, breath shallow. Then came the words that changed everything. You're not his mother, Charles said coldly. No, Lorraine replied. But someone was. Once. Silence followed. Long loaded. Later, Lorraine knocked softly on Julian's door. May I come in? Julian didn't answer, but he didn't lock it either. She entered and sat on the edge of his bed. The room smelled faintly of dust and expensive cologne. He's furious, Julian said without looking at her. I know. He's going to fire you. Probably. Julian's chest tightened. Why did you do it then? Lorraine took a breath. Because Claire didn't exaggerate. Julian flinched. She didn't just quit, Lorraine continued. She filed a report. Julian's head snapped up. What? She tried to, Lorraine corrected. Your father's lawyer discouraged it. He offered money instead. Julian stared at her, stunned. She refused, Lorraine said. That's when I stepped in. Julian felt the floor tilt beneath him. You lied. No, Lorraine said softly. I protected her privacy. He swallowed hard. What happens to me? Lorraine studied him. That depends on what you do next. A beat passed. Then Julian asked, barely audible, Do you hate me? Lorraine's eyes softened. No. Why not? He demanded. Everyone else does. Because I see the boy underneath the armor, she said. And because hate would be easier. I don't choose easy. Julian laughed shakily. You're going to leave. Yes, Lorraine said honestly. But not today. He blinked. You're not. Your father gave me 2 weeks, she said. To transition. Julian's throat tightened. 2 weeks felt like a countdown. That night, Julian lay awake, listening to the house breathe. For the first time, he imagined what it would feel like if Lorraine told everything. And for the first time, he wondered what it would feel like if she didn't. The countdown changed everything. Julian felt it in the way Lorraine watched the clock now, not anxiously, but deliberately. Each morning mattered. Each interaction carried weight. Nothing was wasted. 2 weeks. 14 days before the house swallowed her like it had swallowed everyone else. Julian started noticing things he'd never bothered to see before. Lorraine's routines. The way she always left one light on in the hallway at night. The way she folded laundry with quiet precision, never rushing, never sighing. The way she spoke to the house staff, by name with eye contact like they existed. It unsettled him. On the 3rd day, Julian tested her. He spilled orange juice across the kitchen counter on purpose. Let the glass roll. Let it shatter. The sound echoed. Lorraine looked up from the sink. Took it in. Said nothing. Julian waited for the reaction. The sharp inhale. The clipped tone. The resignation. Instead, she grabbed a towel and handed him another. Careful, she said. Glass cuts deeper than it looks. That was it. No lecture. No threat. Julian's chest burned. You're not even mad, he muttered. I am, Lorraine said calmly. But anger doesn't clean up messes. Responsibility does. He clenched his jaw. You're not my parent. No, she replied. I'm your witness. The word lingered. Later that afternoon, Julian overheard part of a phone call. Lorraine's voice drifted from the study, low but firm. Yes, she said. I understand the pressure. Pause. No, I won't retract my statement. Julian froze. Another pause. I'm aware of the consequences. The call ended. Julian backed away before she could see him. That night, he dreamed of spit on marble floors. Of faceless women leaving through revolving doors. Of Lorraine standing still while the walls closed in. He woke sweating. The next morning, something unexpected happened. Julian apologized. Not for everything. Not even clearly. Just a rough, awkward sentence while they sat in the car waiting for the gate to open. I didn't know, he said, staring straight ahead. Lorraine didn't ask him to explain. I know, she replied. That scared him more than anger ever had. Days passed. The house grew quieter. Staff avoided Charles when he was home. Lawyers' voices echoed through speakerphones late at night. On the 8th day, Daniel Brooks returned. This time, Charles was present. Julian sat on the staircase, unseen, listening. You're creating a paper trail, Charles snapped. You understand that, don't you? Daniel's voice was steady. The trail already exists. Lorraine spoke then. You just never looked. Silence. Then Charles said something Julian had never heard before. What do you want? Lorraine didn't hesitate. For Julian to be evaluated. Properly. That's not happening, Charles said. It's already scheduled, Lorraine replied. Julian's heart slammed. Charles laughed darkly. You think you can force this? I think, Lorraine said, that you've confused power with immunity. Julian backed away, pulse roaring in his ears. That evening he confronted her. You're sending me away, he accused. Lorraine set down the dish she was drying. No. Then why do they need to evaluate me? He demanded. So they can lock me up? Lorraine turned fully toward him. So they can help you. I don't need help, Julian snapped. Yes, she said gently. You do. He shook his head. You don't get to decide that. No, Lorraine agreed. But I get to refuse to pretend you're fine. Julian's voice cracked. If I go, you'll be gone when I get back. Lorraine didn't answer right away. That was worse. I can't promise things I don't control, she said finally. Julian felt something collapse inside him. The next day, Claire's name appeared in a legal document Julian wasn't supposed to see. He saw it anyway. That night he stood outside Lorraine's door, fist raised, shaking. When he finally knocked, she opened it slowly. I didn't mean to ruin her life, Julian said, words tumbling out. I didn't think it was that bad. Lorraine studied him, eyes unreadable. Intent doesn't erase impact, she said. But accountability can change the ending. Julian swallowed hard. Is it too late? Lorraine hesitated. And in that hesitation, Julian felt the ground shift, like the story he'd been telling himself was about to be rewritten, whether he was ready or not. The evaluation was scheduled for a Tuesday. Julian knew because Lorraine circled the date on the kitchen calendar in blue ink. Not red. Not black. Blue, calm, deliberate, impossible to ignore. He stared at it every morning like it might move if he glared long enough. It didn't. The days leading up to it passed strangely. Too normal. Lorraine didn't push him to talk. Didn't rehearse answers. Didn't soften the truth or sharpen it. She just stayed. That alone felt like pressure. On Sunday evening, Julian found her in the garden behind the house, kneeling in the dirt. She had rolled up her sleeves, hands dark with soil, planting something small and fragile. What is that? He asked. Milkweed, Lorraine said. Monarchs need it. Julian frowned. Butterflies? Yes. He watched her press the soil down gently. Why plant it now? Because timing isn't always about convenience, she replied. Sometimes it's about readiness. Julian scoffed. That's vague. She smiled faintly. You're allowed to dislike it. He lingered, then blurted, what if they decide I'm broken? Lorraine didn't look up. Then they'll name the parts that hurt. That's not better. No, she agreed. But it's honest. Tuesday came gray and heavy. Rain tapped softly against the car as they drove. Julian sat rigid in the passenger seat, jaw clenched. The building was smaller than he expected. No gates. No uniforms. Just a modest sign and warm light in the windows. That made it worse. Inside, a woman with kind eyes and tired posture greeted them. Her name was Dr. Eleanor Finch. She spoke directly to Julian. You can call me Eleanor if you like. I don't, Julian said. She nodded. Fair enough. Lorraine waited in the lobby. The door closed. For 2 hours Julian talked. Not smoothly. Not bravely. He deflected. He joked. He went silent. He snapped. Eleanor didn't rush him. She asked about his mother. Julian said he didn't remember her. She asked again differently. He remembered then. The smell of antiseptic. The beeping of machines. The way adults whispered when they thought he was asleep. The day no one came back from the hospital room. When the session ended, Julian felt wrung out. Lorraine stood when he emerged, searching his face. Did you lie? She asked quietly. No, he said. I tried. That was enough. They sat in the car, engine off. What happens now? Julian asked. Lorraine exhaled. Now we wait for the report. The report came 3 days later. Charles read it first. Julian knew because the shouting started before dinner. You humiliated me, Charles roared. You let them write this? Julian stood frozen at the top of the stairs, heart racing. They wrote what they observed, Lorraine replied calmly. I didn't edit it. This says he needs therapy, supervision, structure. He needs support, Lorraine corrected. Charles laughed bitterly. This says I failed. It says your son lost his mother and never recovered, Lorraine said. That's not failure. That's grief untreated. Silence followed. Then something unexpected. Charles's voice broke. Just slightly. Barely enough to notice. I gave him everything, he said. You gave him things? Lorraine replied. Not time. That night, Charles didn't speak to Julian. But he didn't fire Lorraine either. Instead, he canceled a trip. Julian noticed. The next day, Lorraine packed a small box. Julian's chest tightened. You said 2 weeks. I said probably, she corrected gently. He swallowed. Are you leaving? She met his eyes. Not yet. Why? Lorraine hesitated. Then she said, because Claire finally agreed to testify. The words hit Julian like a punch. Against me? He whispered. Against the truth, Lorraine said. Julian felt the walls close in. For the first time, the consequences weren't theoretical. They had names, dates, paperwork, and they were coming. The house changed after that. Not in loud ways. Not with slammed doors or raised voices. It changed in the quiet, unsettling gaps where certainty used to live. Julian felt it most in his father. Charles began coming home earlier. Not early enough to talk. Not early enough to apologize. Just early enough to be present without knowing what to do with that presence. He hovered. At dinner, he asked questions that landed wrong. How was school? He asked one evening, eyes fixed on his plate. Julian shrugged. Fine. Silence followed. The kind that made the food taste like paper. Lorraine watched them both, saying little. She'd learned when to speak, and when to let discomfort do the work. 2 days later, Claire's formal complaint became official. Julian didn't hear about it from his father. He heard it from the driver. Sir, there'll be a change in schedule tomorrow, the man said carefully. Legal appointment. Julian's hands went cold. That night, Julian confronted Lorraine in the laundry room. She's really doing it, he said. Yes. She's not backing down. No. Julian laughed hollowly. Why would she? She doesn't owe me mercy. Lorraine folded a towel. Mercy isn't something you ask for before accountability. He leaned against the machine, breathing hard. What if they take me away? They won't, Lorraine said. You don't know that. I know the system, she replied. And I know your age. And I know the difference between punishment and intervention. Julian stared at her. You sound very sure. I am. He hesitated. How? Lorraine folded another towel. Slower this time. My first job like this, she said quietly, ended with a boy your age in juvenile detention. Julian froze. Because of you? Because no one spoke soon enough, she corrected. I promised myself that wouldn't happen again. The words settled heavy in his chest. The legal process crept forward. Slowly. Methodically. Paper followed paper. Names turned into files. Julian met with Eleanor again. Then again. Therapy became a fixture. He hated it at first. The way it forced him to name things. The way it dismantled the stories he'd used to survive. But slowly, uncomfortably, something shifted. He stopped pretending he didn't remember his mother. He stopped saying nannies deserved it. One afternoon, Eleanor asked, "Why Claire?" Julian stared at the carpet. She flinched. "What did that mean to you?" "That she'd leave," he said. "That I could make it happen fast." Eleanor nodded. "And Lorraine?" Julian didn't answer. That evening, he sat with Lorraine in the kitchen while she chopped vegetables. "You don't flinch," he said suddenly. Lorraine smiled faintly. "I learned not to." "Why?" "Because flinching teaches bullies where to aim." Julian swallowed. "And victims?" Lorraine paused. "It teaches them when to hide." The next morning, Julian found the milkweed sprouting. Tiny. Green. Alive. He stared at it longer than necessary. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. Claire called. Not Julian. Lorraine. Julian overheard only Lorraine's side of the conversation. "Yes," she said softly. "I understand." Pause. "I won't speak for him," Lorraine continued. "That has to come from him." Julian's heart pounded. When the call ended, he asked, "What did she say?" Lorraine met his eyes. "She asked if you'd write a statement." Julian's breath caught. "An apology?" "An acknowledgement," Lorraine said. "In your words. Without excuses." Julian felt panic surge. "I can't." "You can," Lorraine replied. "Whether you choose to is up to you." That night, Julian sat at his desk for hours. The page stayed blank. Every sentence felt wrong. Every word felt like a trap. Near midnight, he finally wrote something. It wasn't polished. It wasn't brave. But it was honest. He didn't know if it would help. He didn't know if it would hurt. He only knew that once the words existed, they couldn't be taken back. And neither could what came next. The letter didn't feel finished when Julian set the pen down. It felt exposed. He read it once. Then again. Each time his chest tightened. The words stared back at him without sympathy. No clever framing. No soft exits. Just the truth sitting there like a bruise. He folded the paper and slid it into an envelope without sealing it. As if leaving it open might let him change his mind later. Sleep didn't come. When morning did, it brought rain and a headache and the faint sound of Lorraine moving through the kitchen. Ordinary sounds. Comforting ones. Julian carried the envelope downstairs. Lorraine looked up when she saw it in his hand. She didn't reach for it. "You don't have to give it to me," she said. "I know," Julian replied. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. "But if I don't, I won't give it to anyone." She nodded once. "May I read it?" He hesitated, then held it out. Lorraine took the letter to the window, letting the daylight fall across the page. She read slowly, carefully. She didn't interrupt herself, didn't flinch. When she finished, she folded it back the same way Julian had. "It's incomplete," she said gently. Julian's stomach dropped. "I knew it." "It doesn't say why you did it," she continued. "And that's okay." He frowned. "It is." "Yes," Lorraine said. "Because this isn't about explaining yourself. It's about acknowledging harm." She met his eyes. "And you did that." Julian swallowed. "Is it enough?" Lorraine didn't answer right away. "Enough," she said finally, "isn't something you decide alone." That afternoon, Charles called his lawyer. Loudly. From the study. Julian heard his name more than once. By evening, the house felt brittle. As if one wrong movement would shatter something expensive and irreplaceable. At dinner, Charles cleared his throat. "I've read the statement," he said, not looking at Julian. Julian froze. Lorraine didn't. She didn't give it to me, Charles said. I asked. Lorraine said nothing. Charles exhaled slowly. You understand this may be used? Yes, Julian said. His heart hammered, but he didn't look away. Charles studied him then. Really studied him. Why did you write it? Julian thought of 100 answers. He chose the simplest one. Because pretending it didn't matter felt worse. The silence stretched. Then Charles nodded once. We'll submit it. Julian's breath left him in a rush. The days that followed were heavy with waiting. Claire didn't respond right away. Neither did the court. Julian returned to therapy. To routine. To small, uncomfortable truths. One evening, Eleanor asked, "What would forgiveness mean to you?" Julian shook his head. "I don't get to want that." Eleanor nodded. "That's a start." Then came the call. Lorraine answered it in the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, posture still. Julian watched her face change. Not soften. Not harden. Settle. When she hung up, she didn't speak immediately. "Well?" Julian asked. Lorraine took a breath. Claire read the statement. "And?" "She believes you meant it." Julian's knees went weak. He grabbed the counter. "That doesn't mean she forgives you," Lorraine added. "It means she heard you." He nodded, throat tight. "What happens now?" "There will be conditions," Lorraine said. "Therapy. Supervision. Accountability." Julian let out a shaky laugh. "That's it." "That's the beginning," she replied. That night, Julian found himself standing outside Lorraine's room again. "You don't have to stay," he said quietly. "I know. But you are." "Yes." "Why?" he asked. Lorraine met his gaze, something unreadable in her eyes. "Because change doesn't mean much if no one stays long enough to see it tested." Julian lay awake long after, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, the future didn't look like a clean escape or a dramatic punishment. It looked slow, messy, and real, which scared him more than anything that had come before. The house had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Julian noticed it first in the mornings. The subtle sounds of Lorraine moving through the kitchen, of dishes clinking, of coffee brewing. Nothing extraordinary. But he felt the difference. It was no longer silence born of fear. It was silence born of routine. And with routine came reflection. One afternoon, Julian found himself in the library. Books lined the walls, heavy with dust and unspoken stories. He picked one at random, feeling the weight in his hands. It wasn't reading he wanted, it was hiding. A safe place where Lorraine couldn't see him, where he didn't have to speak or think. Running from thoughts doesn't make them disappear. He froze. Lorraine stood in the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. She didn't step closer. She didn't need to. The room was small enough that her presence filled it. "I'm not running," Julian muttered, though his voice betrayed him. "You are," she said softly. "But that's okay. Everyone runs sometimes." Julian set the book down. "Why are you still here?" "Because I promised," she said simply. "And because someone needs to stay." He narrowed his eyes. "And what does staying get you?" "Not what I get," Lorraine replied. "What he gets." She gestured toward him. "You." Julian's chest tightened. For a moment he didn't know what to say. No one had ever said something like that to him. Not clearly. Not without conditions, not as a promise, not as truth. Days passed. The legal requirements moved forward. Therapy sessions, meetings, evaluations. They were uncomfortable, but Julian began to notice the patterns. The moments where he could choose something other than control or aggression. The moments where words replaced spit. It didn't make him happy. Not yet. But it made him think. One rainy evening, Julian found Lorraine sitting by the indoor pool. The light filtered through the skylights, casting long reflections across the marble. She hummed quietly, almost to herself. "You always know what to do," Julian said, unable to stop the words from slipping out. Lorraine looked up. "No, I don't." I just know what I can't ignore. You didn't ignore Claire, he said, voice low. Even though it wasn't your problem. She smiled faintly. Sometimes the right thing is also the hardest. You have to make that choice even if no one else will. Julian swallowed hard. The words sat heavy in his chest. He wanted to argue. To say she didn't understand. But he couldn't. She did. And that was terrifying. Later that week, Julian's father finally spoke. Not in anger. Not in lectures. Not in threats. Julian, Charles said, voice unusually calm. I want to understand what's happening here. With you. With Lorraine. With this house. Julian froze. He wasn't used to being addressed directly like that. Usually, Charles's words carried blame or expectations, not curiosity. I don't know, Julian admitted quietly. That's a start, Charles said. Honesty. I can work with that. Julian felt the walls of the house shift again. Small cracks of something unfamiliar. Something he might be able to navigate if he chose to. That evening, Lorraine stayed late in the kitchen, chopping vegetables. Julian watched her from the hallway. For the first time, he considered something he hadn't dared before. He stepped forward. Can I help? Lorraine looked up, surprised, but she nodded. Careful with the knife, she said lightly. He joined her. Awkward at first. Fingers clumsy. Thoughts racing. But he stayed. And for a while, the house wasn't just a place of rules, of threats, of discipline. It was a place where someone noticed him. Where he wasn't just a problem to be solved or a child to be controlled. And as the rain tapped softly against the windows, Julian realized something else. He might not be ready to forgive himself. But maybe, just maybe, he could start to trust someone else. And that, he thought quietly, might be the hardest choice of all. The next day, a new challenge arrived, one Julian didn't see coming, and it would test everything he had learned so far. The next morning began with tension humming through the Hawthorne house like electricity. Julian could feel it before he even opened his eyes, the subtle shift in air, the quickened footsteps of staff moving between rooms, the soft but determined clatter of Lorraine setting plates on the kitchen table. He stayed in bed longer than usual, listening. Something had changed overnight, though he couldn't yet name it. By the time he made it downstairs, Lorraine was already in the sunroom, a stack of papers in her hands. Julian froze in the doorway. Morning, she said, voice calm, almost casual. Sit down. We need to talk. Julian reluctantly perched on the edge of a chair. His father, unusually quiet, lingered near the hallway, arms crossed. Charles didn't look pleased, but he also didn't interrupt. Lorraine handed him a sheet. This is from Claire. Julian blinked. Why me? Because it's addressed to you, Lorraine said. She wants you to read it yourself. Julian tore open the envelope with trembling fingers. The words inside were careful, deliberate. She didn't scream. She didn't accuse. She simply told her story. Every moment of fear, confusion, and hurt. Every time she had felt powerless in his hands. Julian's throat tightened. He had memorized the scenarios. Every act, every reaction, but seeing them written so plainly, it was different. Real. Human. He looked up at Lorraine. Why are you making me do this? To feel it, she said simply. To see what your actions created. Not the fantasy version. The real one. He swallowed hard. It's awful. Yes, Lorraine replied. And it's not just Claire. This is about all the people who came before her. All the moments you pushed away because it was easier to control than to care. Julian's hands shook. He wanted to tear the page, toss it into the fire, erase it from existence. But he couldn't. Do I have to apologize? He whispered. Lorraine shook her head slightly. No. You have to understand. Hours passed as Julian reread the letter, again and again. Each reading stripped away a layer of the armor he had spent years building. Every familiar excuse, every rationalization, every practiced indifference, it fell away. By late afternoon, His hands were raw from holding the paper. His chest felt tight and a wave of dizziness hit him. Lorraine came to sit beside him. "It's a lot," she said gently. "I know. I don't know if I can," Julian admitted. "I don't know if I should." "You can," Lorraine said. "And you should, because understanding this is the only way to stop repeating it." Julian's gaze drifted to the hallway where his father lingered. Charles's presence had softened slightly. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't nodding. But he was watching without judgment, without forcing the outcome. Lorraine spoke again, quieter this time. "There's something else. Claire doesn't just want your acknowledgement. She wants you to decide what kind of person you want to be from here on out. That choice is yours alone." Julian swallowed. The weight of that decision pressed down on him heavier than any punishment, heavier than any threat, heavier than any fear he had ever felt. And yet, for the first time in years, he didn't flinch. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Julian sat alone in the library. The letter lay open before him. He didn't read it again. He just stared at the words, letting them settle. Somewhere deep inside he felt something shift. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. It wasn't relief. Not yet. But it was a crack in the wall he had built around himself. A crack that let light in. And through that crack, he realized Lorraine's presence wasn't just about supervision or safety anymore. It was about choice. His choice. And for the first time, Julian understood that some choices were far harder than others. Not because they were impossible, but because they required seeing the person he had been and deciding if he wanted to be someone else. A soft creak behind him made him turn. Lorraine stood there, hands tucked into her apron, watching him. Her expression was unreadable, but Julian felt supported. Not pitted. Not controlled. Supported. He swallowed hard. I'm ready." Lorraine nodded slightly. "Then we start there." But even as he felt a flicker of hope, Julian didn't notice the shadow moving outside the window, watching. Someone who had been in the periphery all along, waiting for a single misstep. And tonight, that shadow was closer than he realized. The first major test of his new resolve was about to arrive, and nothing in the house, or his life, would ever feel safe again. The test came sooner than Julian expected. It arrived disguised as something ordinary. A Friday afternoon. Gray skies. A substitute driver waiting by the gate because the usual one had called in sick. A change so small it barely registered, except Julian felt the unease immediately. Lorraine noticed it too. She stood by the front window longer than usual, watching the car idle. The driver checked his phone, looked up at the house, looked back down again. "Something wrong?" Julian asked. "Maybe," Lorraine said. "Maybe not." Those words used to comfort him. Now they made his pulse quicken. The ride into town was quiet. Rain streaked the windows. The driver introduced himself, name forgettable, voice too cheerful. Julian answered politely. That alone felt strange. Halfway through the drive, the driver took a turn that wasn't standard. Julian noticed instantly. "This isn't the route," he said. The driver glanced in the mirror, smiled. "Shortcut. Traffic up ahead." Julian's stomach tightened. Lorraine leaned forward slightly. "Pull over," she said calmly. The driver chuckled. "Ma'am, I do this all the..." "Now," Lorraine repeated. Her voice was steady, but something sharp lived underneath it. The car slowed, tires hissing against wet pavement. It stopped near a closed strip mall. "What's going on?" Julian asked, heart pounding. The driver turned in his seat. The smile was gone. "You've got a lot of people talking about you, kid," he said. "Powerful people. Angry people." Lorraine's jaw tightened. "Step out of the vehicle." The man scoffed. "You think you can order me around?" "I know I can report you," Lorraine said. "And I know exactly how this looks." Julian felt the old instinct rise, the urge to dominate, to threaten, to make someone smaller before they could make him afraid. His mouth opened. Then he remembered Claire's letter. The way her words sat on the page, quiet and devastating. He closed his mouth. "Why are you doing this?" Julian asked instead. The driver hesitated. That hesitation told Lorraine everything. "You were hired," she said. "Not by us." The man swore under his breath. "This isn't worth it." He got out of the car. Lorraine immediately dialed emergency services, voice precise, unpanicked. She gave location details. Vehicle description. The man walked away quickly, disappearing into the rain. Julian sat frozen, adrenaline shaking his hands. "What was that?" he whispered. "A warning," Lorraine said. "Or an attempt at one." "From who?" She didn't answer right away. Back home, Charles was waiting. He listened as Lorraine explained. His face went pale in a way Julian had never seen before. "They crossed a line," Charles said quietly. "Yes," Lorraine replied. "They did." Julian stared at his father. "You knew this could happen." Charles didn't deny it. "I thought I could contain it," he said. "I was wrong." That night the house locked down. Extra security. Phones buzzing. Lawyers calling. Julian sat on his bed, staring at his hands. "They're trying to scare me," he said to Lorraine later. "Yes." "Because of Claire." "Yes." Julian swallowed. "If I take it back, if I say I lied, will this stop?" Lorraine's face softened, but her voice didn't. "It might. For a while. And it would teach you that fear decides who you are." Julian closed his eyes. The old version of him would have folded instantly. Would have lashed out or caved in or made someone else pay the price so he didn't have to feel small. He didn't want to be that person anymore. "What if they don't stop?" he asked. Lorraine took a seat across from him. "Then we keep telling the truth. Slowly. Carefully. With protection." Julian laughed weakly. "You make it sound manageable." "It's not," she said honestly. "But it's survivable." He nodded, fear still buzzing in his veins, but something else lived there now too. Resolve. The next morning Julian made a decision. He asked to speak, on record, with the court-appointed advocate. Alone. Charles tried to intervene. Lorraine stopped him. "This has to be his choice," she said. Julian's statement wasn't dramatic. He didn't cry. He didn't posture. He told the truth. About control. About fear. About why hurting others had once felt like safety. When it was over, the room was silent. The advocate closed the file slowly. "This will complicate things," she said. Julian nodded. "I know. But it also clarifies them." That night, as Julian lay in bed, he realized something terrifying and strange. The people trying to scare him hadn't succeeded. And that meant the next move wouldn't be subtle. Whatever came next would be bigger, louder, and impossible to ignore. The backlash didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It arrived quietly. Julian sensed it first in the way phones stopped ringing, in the way staff avoided eye contact, in the way his father's assistants suddenly needed time before returning calls that once came instantly. Power didn't disappear when challenged. It recalibrated. On Monday morning, Julian was called out of school early. Not by his father. Not by Lorraine. By a counselor he'd never met. The office was small. Beige walls. A framed poster about resilience that Julian found almost insulting. The woman across from him spoke gently. Too gently. "There's concern about your emotional stability," she said. "Given recent events." Julian's stomach dropped. "Concern from who?" "Multiple parties," she replied carefully. That answer told him everything. By the time he got home, Lorraine already knew. "They're trying to reframe the narrative," she said quietly. "If they can make you look unstable, your testimony weakens." Julian laughed bitterly. "I am unstable." "Yes," Lorraine said. "And honest about it. That's the difference." Charles wasn't home that evening. Instead, a lawyer appeared. Not the usual one. This one spoke slowly, like every word had been rehearsed for maximum intimidation. You're brave, the man said to Julian. But bravery has consequences. Julian stared at him. Is that a threat? The lawyer smiled thinly. It's advice. Lorraine stepped forward. This meeting is over. It doesn't have to be, the man replied. There's still time to adjust the story. Julian felt the room tilt. No, he said. The lawyer looked almost disappointed. Then prepare yourself. That night, the first article appeared online. It didn't name Julian directly. It didn't have to. It talked about a troubled heir, about aggressive tendencies, about household staff disputes. Julian read it twice, hands shaking. They're painting me as dangerous, he whispered. Lorraine nodded. They're laying groundwork. For what? For discrediting, she said. And isolation. The next day was worse. A former nanny gave a statement. Not about abuse. About difficult behavior. About temper tantrums. About being unmanageable. Julian recognized the pattern instantly. They weren't lying. They were curating. This is my fault, Julian said that night, voice hollow. I did those things. Yes, Lorraine said. And you're owning them. That won't matter. It might, she replied, if you keep choosing consistency. Charles finally spoke late that evening. Not in anger. In fear. This is spiraling, he said, pacing the study. We need to contain it. Julian looked at him. By lying? Charles stopped. By protecting you. From what? Julian asked. The truth? Charles didn't answer. Lorraine did. You don't protect a child by teaching them consequences don't apply, she said. You protect them by standing with them when they do. Charles rubbed his face. You're asking me to burn bridges. No, Lorraine replied. They're already burning. You're choosing whether to pretend you don't smell the smoke. That night, Julian couldn't sleep. He scrolled endlessly. Comment sections. Speculation. Half-truths masquerading as insight. People he'd never met decided who he was. The old instinct flared, hot and familiar. Make them afraid. Make them stop. He clenched his fists. Then he did something else. He opened a new document and started writing again. Not an apology. A record. Dates. Behaviors. Patterns. His own words. His own accountability. When Lorraine found him hours later, she didn't stop him. You know this could be used against you, she said. Yes, Julian replied. But it can also be used for the right reasons. For what reason? She asked. Julian met her gaze, steady. So no one can say they didn't know. The next morning, something unexpected happened. Claire's attorney requested a joint meeting. Not to negotiate. To coordinate. Julian read the message twice, heart pounding. They're not backing down, he said. Lorraine's expression was calm, but her eyes were fierce. No, she said. They're stepping forward. Julian felt fear rise again. But beneath it, something else took root. If this was the storm, then hiding wouldn't save him. Only standing still would. As he closed the laptop, Julian realized the line had been crossed. Not by his enemies, but by himself. There was no returning to who he'd been. And whatever came next wouldn't just test his resolve. It would expose the entire house. The house was quiet, almost deceptively so. Julian stood by the window, watching rain streak the glass. Each drop felt like a countdown. Outside, the world didn't care about accountability or truth or fairness. It just moved. And Julian had learned the hard way that he had to move too. Lorraine appeared silently behind him, holding 2 cups of tea. She didn't ask why he was awake. She just handed him one and waited. He accepted it, hands shaking slightly. They're coming, he said quietly. Lorraine didn't respond immediately. She took a sip of her own cup and let the silence do the work. They won't stop, Julian continued. They'll keep attacking, articles, statements, lawyers, all of it. I don't know how to fight that. You don't fight it, Lorraine said. Not with anger. Not with deflection. You meet it with truth, consistency, and choice. Julian stared at her. You make it sound easy. It's not, she admitted. But it's survivable. And right now that's enough. The next hours were a blur. Legal meetings, calls, emails, evaluations. Every conversation felt loaded. Every glance at his father carried the weight of unspoken pressure. But through it all, Lorraine stayed. Calm, observant, anchored. That evening, the moment arrived Julian had feared and hoped for simultaneously. Claire was at the house. She didn't storm in. She didn't yell. She walked slowly through the door, eyes cautious. Julian's chest tightened. This was the person he had hurt most. The person whose life he had upended with his actions. And now she was here. Lorraine stayed at his side but gave him space. Julian, Claire began, voice soft but firm. I came to hear it from you. He swallowed hard. I know I hurt you, he said, voice barely above a whisper. I can't undo it. I shouldn't have any of it. I was afraid and I took it out on you. Claire studied him. Eyes scanning for sincerity, for performance, for deception. I don't know if you can forgive me, Julian continued, but I want to take responsibility. Silence. Heavy, electric. Then Claire did something Julian never expected. She stepped forward, and without a word kissed his cheek. A fleeting gesture. A quiet acknowledgement. Not forgiveness. Not approval. But recognition. Julian's body froze. Lorraine watched, unreadable. Charles stood behind her, tension written into every line of his posture. I don't know what that means, Julian whispered. It means I see you, Claire said softly. Not just the person who hurt me. The one who's trying now. The words sank in slowly. Julian's chest loosened just slightly. A crack in the armor. Later, the adults left the room, leaving Julian and Lorraine alone. He turned toward her. Why me? He asked. Why didn't you leave like everyone else? Lorraine smiled faintly. Because someone had to stay. And because someone had to believe you could. Julian laughed softly, a sound rusty from disuse. I don't even know who I am anymore. You'll find out, she said. Slowly, carefully, honestly. He looked around the room, at the rain-streaked windows, at the quiet house, at the woman who had refused to abandon him when everyone else did. And he realized something. Survival wasn't about fear. It wasn't about control. It was about connection. About seeing someone, being seen, and choosing to stand anyway. The house, once a place of walls and whispers, now felt alive. Uncertain. Vulnerable. Real. Julian exhaled. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Possibility. And outside, the storm began to break, letting light filter through the clouds. He knew the battles weren't over. That danger still lurked. That life would demand hard choices. But for the first time, Julian also knew he could face them. With truth. With courage. With someone who refused to let him face them alone. And in that quiet moment, as rain softened against the glass, Julian understood the most important lesson of all. Change didn't happen instantly. It happened one choice at a time. And tonight he had made the right one. The story wasn't over. But for the first time he was ready to write the next chapter himself. If you've been following Julian's journey, don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories like this, and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because every story is better when shared.